Hi, I'm Bishop Todd Hunter. Welcome to the C4SO podcast.
Hi, I'm Todd Hunter. Welcome to the C4SO podcast. Today we have the third and final installment of a series that we've been doing where we've been looking at the work of William Bridges as he helps us think about change and transitions. In the first episode, I gave us some background on Bridges' work. On the last episode, my coach, Dwayne Grobman, helped us think about how to work with Bridges corporately or with entities. And today, our guest is the new bishop-elect of C4SO, the person who will be my successor, Jeff Bailey. And today, we talked to Jeff about the personal aspects of going through change and transition. All right, Jeff Bailey, great to have you on the C4SO podcast.
Yeah, great to be here.
I'm wondering how you're feeling because you're already a little bit of a legend in your own time in certain C4SO circles. Lots of people have gotten to know you through the election process, and you've had to answer a million questions and all that. Introduce yourself a bit to our audience.
Sure. Yeah, no, this feels like a familiar spot here, sitting in front of a microphone and a camera for the however long it was, 3 months through the selection process. So yeah, I feel right at home here. But yeah, I'm calling in from Washington, D.C., where I live with my wife and 3 kids. We just graduated our last and final child yesterday. She walked through graduation ceremony. So we are now officially empty nesters with 3 kids in college. I'm not sure how we should have thought through the timing of that, maybe a little bit more.
That's great. So great to have you. Well, Jeff, I wanted you on today because, as you know, you and I and C4SO are all going through a lot of change, and we've been working a bit the last couple episodes with William Bridges' work on transitions and the inner aspects that are associated with change. And so a couple of episodes ago, I did a bit of explanation on Bridges' work, and then last episode, I unpacked the organizational aspects of transitions with my coach, Dwayne Grobman. And then today, I want us to dig in a little more personally for our listeners who don't lead churches or don't lead, religious nonprofits. They just are our listeners. They're people who have to go through change. And I think it'll give C4SO a bit of a way to get to know you as well. And that is to talk about how you've been going through this transition the last 10 months, because we started talking about the possibility of this when I announced last June. So maybe it's going on 12 months now that this is at least been on your radar screen one way or the other. So just before we get there, for the sake of our listeners who might have missed one or both of the last sessions, the main point that Bridges makes that I think is so helpful is that there's a difference between change and transition. Bridges says it isn't the changes that do us in, it's the transitions. Change, he said, is situational. It's external. It's something that's happening, like my retirement or a new bishop called Jeff, right? These are just external things that are happening. But Bridges says transition is the psychological process people go through to come to terms with the new situation. So Bridges, as you know, names these 3 stages in the process: an ending, and then a neutral zone and a new beginning. And I first read this when it first came out, and I can't remember. It feels like it's decades ago. And I just remembered that was so paradigm shifting that, well, no, wait a minute, this is just a new beginning. And the idea that, no, actually you yourself and you're leading an organization through an ending. And then a neutral zone. Nobody had ever heard of a neutral zone. Everybody knew the word ending or new beginning, but nobody had heard of this Bridges idea of neutral zone. And so he makes this point that transitions begin with an ending, that we first must let go of the old thing, and that we need to let go of the past before we can embrace the new era. So what I'm wondering is, like, as you've gone through this, if we take Bridges at his word, what have you found yourself needing to let go of?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do love Bridges' work. It's incredibly helpful on so many different levels. I think in some ways, this letting go process probably started for me actually about a year ago, even a few months before you and I started talking about the possibility of different things. And before this came onto my radar with C4SO, I remember, it was last spring. So over a year ago, sitting with a group of Anglican urban church planters. We would get together once a year for a retreat and talking about where we were at with things and just giving updates on our lives. And I remember stating to that group, and I think it was the first group of people I'd actually said this to, I said, I feel like change is coming. I feel like what I've been doing for the last 4+ years is coming to an end. but I don't know what's next. And it was a strange place to be. It was a place I hadn't really experienced before, of just knowing in my guts that what I'd been doing was coming to an end, but I didn't know what was next. I knew in part that the work that I'd been doing in Diocese of Christ Our Hope, a lot of what I'd wanted to accomplish had been accomplished, not completely, but the things that I'd had in mind, we had gotten there. Mm-hmm. But it was more than that. It was something that I needed to sit with and not try to plan the next thing, but to simply name the fact that I felt like something was coming to an end, and I wasn't trying to then scramble to figure out what was next, but the naming of it actually felt like an act of faith. And to be able to simply sit there with that uncertainty, and that was actually an important step.
Like, how have you processed that uncertainty, that sense of an ending is coming, but there's not even a new beginning in view yet? You just have these first senses of an ending. Help our listeners understand, like, what are the spiritual disciplines or practices that you've employed to stay present to that ending with not even a no beginning in mind, so no neutral zone, just these first sort of gut instincts. I don't know, you might want to talk about it in Ignatian terms of consolation or desolation or whatever comes to your mind. Like, how have you spiritually kept yourself grounded in those uncertain times?
It's helpful you mentioning the categories of Ignatian, consolation, or desolation. I think I experienced it as a kind of desolation, not devastating.
Yeah.
But there's this sense of loss where you feel like something's coming to an end. I felt like what was happening in Christ Our Hope was coming to a natural end. And at the same time, I was feeling this in other areas of my life as well. So I just mentioned we sent our youngest child through high school graduation a year ago. I was staring at the fact that she was going to be a high school senior and we were about to become empty nesters.
Yeah.
And I was actually feeling the loss of that as well, that I was moving out of a season of family life as well. And interestingly, it wasn't just the change in family life that I knew was coming. It was representative to me of a certain season of life. Like, I'm about to become a person who doesn't have kids at home anymore, or they might be home in the future. But, having kids in school.
Right.
And in my mind, I associated that with a certain kind of age, like, oh, I'm in an era where I have kids at home in school, and I'm about to move into a new era of empty nesters, which for me was older. So I found myself navigating complex feelings about aging at the same time as this was happening as well. So I think in terms of the spiritual practices, I remember once hearing, I don't know if it was a therapist or a coach or somebody saying that the things that trip people up and keep them from moving on is a failure to grieve properly, to actually be attentive to loss and to lean into that and to begin to name that. I'm an Enneagram 3. I'm instinctively thinking about what's next. It's very hard. It's actually hard to sit in the present. Yeah. I don't want to look at the past. And if there's negative feelings associated with it, I really don't want to look at it. I want to think positive and look forward. Yeah. And so I think for me, the spiritual practice was, especially when I was journaling in the morning during my prayer time, to begin to be more attentive to my internal state and to begin to name those feelings and experiences, even if, or especially if they were negative, or if there was sadness or grief attached to it. Right. So I think it was a season of desolation, but it also felt like a kind of freeing season where I was beginning to learn to be okay with that. Yeah. To name that and to know that this is part of healthy growth and maturity, is to notice and name those things and to sit with it and to be with it.
Yeah, I sometimes joke that Eugene Peterson invented the words alert or noticing. I feel like I learned those two words from him, or I don't know, Nouwen or Ignatian. I feel like those words did not come into the English vocabulary anywhere except for through Christian spirituality. But that is so important and so core, as you know, because, as you said, you happen to discover some grief. Other people might notice uncertainty or anxiety or fear or worry or, who will I be in this new situation or whatever. So I just want to underscore what Jeff is saying here, that a major part of an ending is to just notice without judgment what's real and sit with the Spirit. And the Spirit's not going to judge you about it. Whatever it is real, and to find a way to sit with it. Jeff mentioned, journaling in his prayer time. Others might think of silence or solitude. Others might think of worship. Any of the spiritual practices can be helpful once one has noticed where they really are. So sort of having a diagnosis, so to speak, before we try to put some sort of prescription on it. So thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful. All right.
Well,
so
I think just,
go ahead,
as you're
please.
saying that, Todd, too, I think, the plus side of that is you're sitting with it, not in order to fix it, not in order to simply move on with it. But I think that the gift that came out of that is in naming those things. I also noticed then a deepening sense of dependence on the Lord in that space. Because once you name that, it gives you permission to say, I can't control this. I can't control these outcomes. Whether it's with family or even in ministry, when a season of ministry comes to an end, you look back and you inevitably feel some regrets about things you could have done better or done differently or would have done in addition if you'd had bandwidth for it. And so to be able to look back at that and to name that, it actually deepens a sense of, I've got to give all this to the Lord and trust these outcomes, these people, these situations to things that he can do things that I can't.
Yeah. A major point of Bridges is that if we rush through these processes, either the ending or the neutral zone, and don't sit with those ending sorts of feelings that you're describing, Jeff. But my temperament would be to not cling to the past. Like some people, that's their thing of, oh my gosh, I just can't let go of these relationships or this job description I loved or this company or this church or whatever. And then other people with different temperaments are like just rushing on to the next thing. And that would be my tendency. Yeah. But if I rush in that way and don't do what you're saying, we actually bring a less than idealized version of ourselves into the new thing. And it's not helpful.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's completely true.
All right. So let's think back again to the first episode where we said that this progression from an ending to the neutral zone and to a new beginning, it's really real and it's challenging. And it's a process to disengage from what's been known and then to find comfort in the new and learn to embrace it. And what I want to say here is what I've learned over decades and decades of leading organizations is that we all do this in different ways and at different paces. It's just so important that we're kind and gracious to each other and our colleagues as we're all going through this. So Bridges says that before you can get to a new beginning, we pass through the ending that Jeff and I have been talking about, and then through a second phase, a neutral zone. And this is classic liminality. If you're not familiar with that term, liminal, it just means you're not in an old phase, but you're not in a new phase. You're in this in-between space where the old is gone or going and the new has not yet appeared. I often think of stepping from your bedroom into the hallway. So your right foot's in your bedroom, your left foot's up in the air, hasn't quite hit the hallway yet. That's classic liminality. You're in between two spaces. And this normally produces a mix of anxiety, sometimes confusion, but sometimes, and like this would be true for someone like me, it can spark massive creativity. And then that creativity is the sparkly new thing, right? And so then I want to rush to that, creative new thought. So I'm wondering, Jeff, with the election process passed of you being elected bishop, and we have consent coming up, and as we're recording this in about a week, and then consecration coming up at the end of September. Well, Jeff, you're in a liminal phase. How's this feeling to you?
Yeah. It's a great question. In some respects, the liminal phase has been going on for a while. The search process itself was a real exercise in liminality. It went on for, I think, in an official way, 8 months. There's the whole, behind the scenes process, and then there's the public piece of that. So it was, 8 months of real liminality of being invited into something that you want to be present to, but you have no idea what the outcome is going to be. So how to be present to that without trying to control anything. And so I went into it from the start with a real desire to approach it with, what's often termed as Ignatian indifference.
Yes.
My phrase, I often say,
unpack that phrase because people might not know what it is.
Yeah. So, how do we approach this in a totally open-handed way where we are genuine, we're trying to enter into a state in which we are genuinely as okay with one outcome or another. And so the phrase that I often said to people would say, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? And I'd say, I'm engaged in intentional passivity right now.
Yeah.
I'm trying to lean into a very sort of passive, open, present state. And of course, as the process goes forward, you begin to imagine the future and begin to imagine different scenarios. And for me, the key was, how do I imagine those without getting attached to those imaginations? How do I still approach those in an open-handed kind of way? So it was a real exercise in that. Now, after the election, you would think, oh, well, you're out of that phase of liminality. But actually, I just find I'm in a different season of liminality. And so the election has happened, but as you mentioned, the vote of assent comes up in the next week or two at the College of Bishops. And then after that is consecration as a bishop. And then after that, we've got 5 or 6 months where I'm coadjutor, right? That Anglican term. Of where we
co-bishop with right to succeed.
That's right. Yes. Co-agitator, coadjutor. And so what's interesting is that liminality can actually just show up in different ways. I think it was Ignatius who said that we tend to think of discernment as these distinct kind of bounded situations where fixed seasons in which we're trying to decide something. And then once the decision has been made, the discernment process is over. But the reality, Ignatius said, is that actually we just move from one mode of discernment into another. We move from discerning a particular kind of decision, but once the decision's made, then we have to discern, how do we live that out? How do we implement it? And that season brings with it a whole new set of questions and unknowns and perplexities. Yes. And so I think part of the challenge, and maybe this is true for all of us, and it certainly is for me, is that we have to learn to recognize and be okay with living in a kind of constant state of liminality, where there's a lot more unknowns than we think. At least I have in mind. I'm going to get to this settled place where we just live in the present, and there's not going to be lots of questions. The thing is always in the future. There's always unknowns and things. There's a sense of kind of fragility to things.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's work, sometimes it's family, sometimes it's health. It's all these things that come our way that we have to learn to live in these open-handed kinds of ways and learn to simply be present to those things with deeper dependence on God and not on certain outcomes happening in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And, I love the Ignatian idea of indifference, but I hadn't applied it to liminality. I'm really glad you did. So I want to circle back there again because not everybody will be really in tune with Ignatian spirituality. So indifference, as Jeff said, does not mean I don't care. And it doesn't mean God doesn't care, or it doesn't mean I don't have a feeling or a thought about this. It doesn't mean anything like that. For Ignatius, indifference meant something like, the only thing that matters to me is discovering the will of God. Yeah, everything else is a matter of indifference. I think that's close to a direct quote, but don't trust me on that.
Yeah.
So for Ignatius, it was a way of being like really passionately obedient. It wasn't him saying, oh, I don't care about anything anymore in a sort of cynical way or defeatist, or what's the word where you're just sort of checked out. No, it was for him, it was a way of being like exquisitely present to his life.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. No, I think that's a really helpful addition there, because you're right. For Ignatius, it wasn't complacency. Indifference is not complacency.
Right.
It's actually a radical commitment to what does God want here, and that's what I want, no matter what. And everything else doesn't matter.
All else except for discovering what God wants.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So as you've gone through this, Jeff, what have you noticed have been your temptations? Like I said, I think mine would always be to be scratching to the future, crawling to the future if I have to, maybe a little bit of impatience, in there somewhere. What have you noticed that have been temptations for you as you've had to navigate this liminal space?
Yeah, I think my temptations are probably similar. And I don't know, maybe that's true for lots of leaders because you're intrinsically looking to the next thing. You want to get to the next thing. So my temptation is certainly to rush ahead. I think for me, in particular, it's a rush. It's a sense of urgency to try to get a comprehensive view on things.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to be an intuitive leader, wanting to see the kind of connections between things and to see what's bubbling up and to be able to operate out of a kind of instinct or intuition. And that comes for me out of having a kind of broad, comprehensive sense of things. So it drives my family or friends crazy if they go to a museum with me, if they will let me,
I know where
rather
this is going.
than going just to the first room that's on your left and walking through. If they'll let me, I will speed walk through the entire museum to get a quick overall view and then decide where I want to spend the most time. Because otherwise, if I'm in a room, in the back of my mind is I might be spending time here with some paintings that I kind of like, but I'm missing, German expressionism or something where I want to spend half the day. And so I feel that way sometimes in, my approach to any number of different situations is how quickly can I get to a comprehensive view on things? And that's not always the best way to do it. And so what I've been trying to do within C4SO is I'm having conversations with folks and just beginning that process really is to not rush that process, not to try and fit as many conversations into 1 week as possible, but to simply allow that cumulative process to unfold as I'm present with people and all the amazing things that's happening around the diocese.
Yeah. Let's deepen this a little bit, both personally and sort of corporately. And in terms of bridges, like what's the problem with rushing? Like think of that in formational senses, and then we'll come back to more corporate leader for the leaders who are listening. And, you and I have both named rushing, but it could be that somebody's clinging to the past or is sort of paralyzed by anxiety or whatever, but let's just stick to what you and I have confessed. Like in terms of bridges, why is that a problem? Like, why is that something to be attentive to? Why would rushing be a possible problem?
That's a great question. It's been too long since I've read Bridges, so you may have the correct answer where Bridges is concerned on this. But I do think, thinking again about liminality, thinking about the work of Victor Turner, talking about these kinds of spaces where in the uncertainty, in the disorientation of those spaces and the desire to move quickly, you end up just reaching too quickly for whatever the next thing is.
Yeah.
You miss the creativity. You miss the kinds of things that may bubble up and that's where God is. That's what God's doing. But we have to have space and time for that to unfold. But that can be a little bit nerve-wracking to go at that pace. And it feels safer to grab onto whatever feels known, or again, it's so often about control. What gives me a sense of control rather than being able to live in a more trusting place and to see what emerges.
Yeah. And what about with your leadership hat on? Like imagine a rector trying to lead something in his church and it's going to have to go through this ending liminal new beginnings phase, or somebody who's, a leader at work or whatever. Why is it important for a leader to notice their own proclivity? Because what I'm thinking of is like, okay, I might have a tendency to rush, but I'll just say as a leader of C4SO, I'm surrounded by other really gifted, godly people who might be in 19 different places. And so I feel like for me, part of the reason it's important for a leader to notice themselves is that it allows them to situate themselves in the place, the position, but B, it reminds them that they're in a community of people that are always going through this too. Are going through their own internal shakings as well. And so that doesn't mean necessarily that we move at the pace of the slowest person or anything like that. It could mean any number of things. But I just think it's super important to get back to what you said a minute ago, attentive, just noticing. I like to say reality is our friend. Yeah. It's when we're detached from reality, whether that's facts or emotions or whatever, that I find leaders get in most trouble. If we can be present to ourselves and present to what everybody else is going through, we can have some hope of getting them through this kind of corporate liminality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's interesting as I have been having conversations with folks across C4SO post-election. So even over just the last few weeks and thinking about that attentiveness to the collective and to the whole, and not just to what the leader is is going through. It's interesting. One of the things I've noticed is in general, a lack of anxiety in the people in C4SO I've talked to. It's almost like they have been through their own liminal process.
Yeah.
And not that we're completely on the other side of that, but it feels like they've been through a healthy liminal process and have a lack of anxiety about that. And I think that probably speaks to the process that you and the diocesan team and staff and key leaders across the board have really approached this process in general, which is to give space, to give time, to give room for people to react, to have very clear processes of communication that keep people updated, that feels like this is a transparent thing happening. So it's really struck me in my conversations with folks thus far that this has felt like a really healthy process. There's no perfect way of doing this. And part of it is recognizing everybody approaches change in different ways. But to the degree that we can create space, I think, in a diocese or in our churches or with our leadership team or with our vestries or parish councils, remembering and recognizing that you're not going to necessarily be on the same time clock or speed or approach to change as I am. And I need to be able to listen to that and hear that creates a much healthier process for organizations to come through that successfully.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. All right. So Bridges teaches, we begin with an ending. We go through a neutral zone, and only then do we make a new beginning. And some of Bridges' description about how you can know you're in a new beginning phase and done with the liminality is that we begin to see some of the goodness of the change. We begin to live into the new reality. We start feeling significant clarity and some acceptance about the new reality. And with that then comes with it a sense of confidence, like, oh, I can see this is who I am in this new space. And then with that, some energy to learn and a commitment to the future of the group. So you've said a little bit about this, and thank you for that great compliment of seeing a basic non-anxious presence in C4SO. But what glimpses of the new beginning are you beginning to see, if any? Like, are you getting any glimpses, or are you still stuck firmly in the neutral zone?
Yeah, it's certainly coming up in all kinds of ways. I think, if I were to describe the sense of what I'm hearing from folks as we think about the future, I would describe it as a sense of forward-looking continuity. There's a real sense of gratitude for what's been
beautiful. That's really
built.
Beautiful.
Gratitude for what's been built in C4.
Continuity. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I think there's a sense of there's something special here, and a real gratitude for that, but not in a grasping kind of way. Not like we need to hold on to that.
Yeah.
But more in the sense of we've got this foundation. Ultimately, it's a gift of God. It also reflects your leadership over the years and the leadership of really incredible leaders across C4SO. And so we've got this foundation, but there's also more to do. And actually, we're just getting started.
Yes.
And so how do we build on this really healthy foundation to go forward?
Do you find any hopes bubbling up? Do you find any snippets of vision bubbling up? In that sort of that Bridges term of, beginning to, I think I see, potentialities or.
Yeah. There's all kinds of things bubbling up. I think there's a couple things that come through to me. One is the sense of over the last 10 plus years, however long it's been, God's brought all kinds of growth. And in some ways, we've been running to keep up and to bring shape and form and to steward that well. At the same time, we don't want to just assume that lasts forever. There's seasons to this, to these kinds of things. And so I'm hearing in part, how do we begin to ask the very thoughtful, strategic, intentional questions about what does healthy growth look like in a way that's cooperating with what God is doing, but not taking that for granted? Yeah. How do we begin asking these questions of not just church planters coming our way, but where else should we be church planting and praying for God to bring people? And we want to see more growth in racial and ethnic diversity in our churches and our leaders. And how do we not just pray and aspire to that, but how do we get very intentional and strategic about bringing that more about? How do we get more thoughtful and strategic about raising up new leaders? So I think there's that piece of things. But I think coupled with that, and both in what I'm hearing, and I think you asked what kind of hopes are bubbling up in me as well as I think about the future. If I think about the vineyard 25, 30 plus years ago. Or when I hear the stories from you or from others about the Jesus movement. And so many things happened in terms of evangelism and church planting and leaders and people taking risks and doing all kinds of courageous things. And all of that was amazing and incredible. But what it came out of was fundamentally renewal that God was doing. It was this work of the Spirit. And I think as I listen to others and hear what's on their heart, and as I think about what I long for God to do in these next few years, it's on the one hand being very intentional and being thoughtful and strategic, not taking anything for granted, and at the same time saying, how do we create space for the Holy Spirit to do whatever works of renewal he wants to do in us and through us? And it looked one way 25, 30 years ago, looked one way in the Vineyard or in the Jesus movement. It may look that way again in the future. It might look completely different. But whatever that looks like, that's really what we want is we want this work of renewal out of which then we're just trying to keep up and we're trying to bring thoughtful structure and channels for what ultimately the Spirit is doing. So I think it's this dual call of thoughtful, strategic, intentional leadership and also asking God to do new works of renewal in our time that we get to be part of.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Thanks for being here, Jeff. And a great segue to how I wanted to end this episode. I ended the first episode with this snippet from John O'Donohue's poem For a New Beginning. Dwayne read it over us the last episode as a blessing. And I would like to close this series with this same snippet of poetry from John O'Donohue. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of new beginning. Awaken yourself to adventure. Hold nothing back. Learn to find ease in risk. Soon you will home in a new rhythm. Amen. May it be so. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. So great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the C4SO podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and tell a friend. And leave us a review. It helps us spread the word. Grace and peace.